So if it's not all that stuff, shouldn't we be looking somewhere else than the spending side for a solution? And the answer is certainly yes. Well, Illinois has an unfunded pension liability. You may have heard of this. It's over $42 billion with a B dollars. It's this big column right here. That would be the largest unfunded liability of any state in the entire nation. The next worst state is Ohio at 29. The national average is 7. We have a significantly greater unfunded pension liability than the state of California. California has 3 times our economy, 3 times our state budget, and over 300,000 more public employees. And our unfunded liability is almost $20 billion greater than theirs. To pay it off under existing law, we have to come up with, well, I don't know, lots of money over the next few years. In fact, as this pension ramp shows you, in out years, we have to get in excess of $16 billion in 1 year to fund this unfunded liability, to pay it off. Well, I want to be clear, we can't do that. In fact, the last 2 years, fiscal year 2006 and 2007, we owed over $2 billion in each of those years to the pensions, and we didn't have enough money to pay it. So the state only put in $900 million in 2006 when it owed $2.1 billion, and it only put in $1.3 billion in 2007 when it owed $2.5. Now, employees are still funding their share. Our investment returns from TRS are good, above national averages. Our costs for our defined benefit system are low, right around the national average. Our benefit, you know, I love all this stuff about the benefits that we pay, the overly generous benefit. The average benefit across all the state's 5 public employee systems is $18,000 a year. That's our average benefit. And it's within national averages. So, to be very clear and a step back again, the 5th largest state in the nation, from both an economic and population standpoint, cannot afford to give its employees average benefits with average costs, even though it has the lowest number of employees per capita in the nation. That's our current fiscal system. Well, what about revenue growth every year, right? We get more money every year? Not so much. Once again, after adjusting for inflation, what you could see is revenues don't really grow in Illinois. They lag. And when they lag, when they don't even keep up with inflation, then legislators make this decision. Gee, do I want to cut health care and education and domestic violence, or should I just skimp what I owe the pension system? What do you think they decide to do politically? So over the last 30 years, this revenue problem is really the reason the state has this significant unfunded pension liability. The problem is, that's coming home to roost. We've got to pay that off. Constitutional obligation, got to do it. And as the dollars get bigger every year and our revenues get smaller and healthcare demands go up, that squeezes out available tax revenue to fund current public services like education and everything else. This is a structural deficit, which is just a fancy economic way of saying this is a picture of how bankrupt, in fact, the state of Illinois' tax system is. It's a pretty common sense picture, really. All we did was say, look, let's assume in 2007 the state had actually balanced its budget. It didn't. It had $3.1 billion of deficit spending. But benefit of the doubt, let's say they balanced their budget. If you just adjust for inflation and population growth and assume continuing current program, not adding a program, not expanding a program, just doing tomorrow what you do today, what would that cost? And the blue line shows you the cost of continuing today's services through the next few years. The red line shows you what our tax system will generate in revenue over that same period of time. The gap between the cost of public services and the revenues we are going to generate is the structural deficit that is built into the structure of how we tax versus the cost of the services we provide. And that is an ugly picture. It shows the state cannot even afford to do what it's doing today, much less find the $2 billion it needs to do a major increase to school funding. So without tax reform, it's game over. All right, so I'll be happy to take any questions you happen to have. Yeah.
Hi, Ralph. You make a pretty persuasive argument for funding reform. What are some reasons possibly why a legislator wouldn't want to move on this particular initiative?
Well, number one, it involves taxes. Legislators like funding services. They don't like telling taxpayers how you got to pay for them. And so it's always a tough political thing, and especially in this environment when the Democrats and the Republicans have become so polarized and everyone is talking about the word tax as if it's a bad thing. And what you really have to do is get voters energized to go to their elected officials and say, you know what, I'll have your back when you run for re-election. So you really got to take that personal concern that most elected officials have about taking a stance on taxes out of the equation. And if you did that, voters are already ahead of them. 67% of the voters in the state think we absolutely have to have some sort of tax reform to get this done. So it's just a question of getting that message to the legislators.
Hello, I'm Jim Grimes, and with me today to comment on what we just saw, Ralph Martire's presentation on the fiscal crisis, is Ken Swanson, President of the Illinois Education Association. Ken, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We just saw an interesting presentation. What's your reaction?
Ralph Martire makes a compelling case that we have a serious school funding crisis in this state. It's obvious the status quo cannot be sustained. It cannot be accepted any longer. The time is now for a change.
So what would be the answer? What has to happen now?
There are two proposals currently being discussed in the legislature. The governor and Senate President Emil Jones have put forward a plan, the Tax Fairness Plan, that would fund Illinois schools through a new revenue stream through a gross receipts tax. Others are suggesting that an increase in the state income tax and expanding the sales tax into the service economy is an alternative that should be considered. Our message to every citizen of Illinois is simply this: something must be done now, this spring, this session of the legislature. Ask your state senator, ask your state representative, and ask the governor to enact legislation that will fund Illinois public schools adequately, not just this year or next year, but for years to come.
Right. Well, thank you for coming in and sharing your perspective on
Thank you
the
very
fiscal
much.
crisis.
Appreciate it.
You just saw Ralph Martire's presentation from the Tax and Budget Accountability Center on the fiscal crisis. And thank you again, Ken, for joining us from the Illinois Education Association.
Thank you.